There is a stretch of ocean that has haunted sailors and aviators for more than a century. It lies between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, covering roughly 500,000 square miles of open water. They call it the Bermuda Triangle, though some prefer its other name, the Devil's Triangle. Over the decades, more than 50 ships and 20 aircraft have vanished within its boundaries, taking with them over 1,000 souls who were never seen again. Tonight, we will journey into the heart of this mystery and explore the most disturbing disappearances ever recorded in its waters. The afternoon of December 5th, 1945, was unremarkable in almost every way. The sun hung high over Fort Lauderdale, Florida, casting long shadows across the runways of the Naval Air Station. The temperature hovered around 67 degrees, and the wind came in gentle gusts from the southwest, carrying with it the faint salt smell of the Atlantic. It was the kind of day that made flying feel easy, almost routine. For the 14 men preparing to board 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers that afternoon, this was supposed to be nothing more than a training exercise, a final practice run before graduation. They had done this before. They had flown these routes over the Bahamas countless times. The Avenger was a reliable aircraft, a veteran of the Pacific War that had proven itself in combat against the Japanese. None of them could have known that they were about to become the most famous missing persons in aviation history. The mission was designated Navigation Problem Number 1, a standard exercise that had been completed by 18 other flights that very same day. The plan was simple. The 5 bombers, collectively known as Flight 19, would depart from the Naval Air Station, fly east for roughly 56 miles to a cluster of small islands called Hens and Chicken Shoals, conduct practice bombing runs on a sunken target, then turn north and proceed over Grand Bahama Island before changing course a final time and heading southwest back to base. The entire flight was expected to take approximately 3 hours. It was the sort of mission that these men had trained for, the sort of mission that should have ended with a routine landing and perhaps a cup of coffee before dinner. The Weather Bureau had predicted conditions favorable for flying, with only scattered showers possible later in the day. Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor was the flight leader that day. At 28 years old, he was an experienced aviator with roughly 2,500 flying hours under his belt, most of them in aircraft, just like the Avenger. He had completed a combat tour in the Pacific Theater during World War II, serving as a torpedo bomber pilot aboard the aircraft carrier USS Hancock. Taylor knew what it meant to fly in dangerous conditions. He had faced enemy fire and returned home. He had recently transferred to Fort Lauderdale from Naval Air Station Miami, where he had been an instructor, teaching young pilots the very skills that would be tested today. By all accounts, he was competent, capable, and well-suited to lead a training flight over familiar waters. His 4 student pilots were young and eager, just days away from completing their training and earning their wings. Marine Captain Edward Joseph Powers was 23 years old, a fresh-faced officer from New York who had already proven himself a capable flyer. Marine Captain George William Stivers was 24 from Georgia, with a quiet confidence that his instructors had noted approvingly. Marine Corporal Alan Costnar and Marine Sergeant Robert Gallivan filled out the crews. Each of the student pilots had logged approximately 300 hours of total flying time and 60 hours specifically in the Avenger. They were young men on the cusp of their military careers, men who had dreams and families waiting for them back home, men who climbed into their cockpits that December afternoon expecting to return for dinner. During the pre-flight checks, one curious detail emerged that would later take on ominous significance. None of the 5 aircraft had working clocks. Navigation over open water relied heavily on dead reckoning, a technique that required pilots to track their heading, speed, and elapsed time to calculate their position. Without functioning clocks, the crews would have to rely on their personal watches. It was a minor inconvenience that no one thought worth delaying the flight to address. The instructors assumed each man had his own watch. The assumption would prove costly. The 5 aircraft took off at approximately 2:10 in the afternoon. Each plane carried a 3-man crew, except for one aircraft that carried only 2, because one crew member had requested and been granted permission to miss the flight due to a premonition of danger. In total, 14 men lifted off from that Florida runway into the warm December sky. The first leg of the mission proceeded exactly as planned. The bombers reached Hens and Chicken Shoals around 2:30 and dropped their practice bombs without incident. At 3 o'clock, one of the student pilots requested and received permission to drop his last bomb. Everything was going according to schedule. The Avengers then turned north for the second leg of their journey, and somewhere over the open water, something went terribly wrong. The first indication of trouble came at approximately 3:45 in the afternoon. Lieutenant Robert Cox, a flight instructor who was flying near the Florida coast with his own student, overheard a strange transmission on his radio. 2 voices were conversing, one asking for compass readings, the other responding that he didn't know where they were. The voices sounded confused, disoriented. Cox immediately tried to make contact. When he finally got through, the voice on the other end identified himself as Lieutenant Taylor. Taylor's words were troubling. "Both compasses are out," he reported. His voice carried an edge of frustration, perhaps the first hint of fear. "I am over land, but it is broken. I am sure I am in the Keys, but I don't know how far down, and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." This was the first hint that something was seriously wrong. Taylor believed his compasses had malfunctioned and that he was flying over the Florida Keys, which would have placed him somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico, west of the Florida Peninsula. If this were true, the logical course of action would be to fly north or northeast to reach the mainland. But Taylor was wrong. He was not over the Keys. He was actually somewhere over the Bahamas, far to the east of where he believed himself to be. His compasses may or may not have failed, but his sense of direction had certainly betrayed him. If he flew west, as several of his student pilots apparently suggested, he would reach Florida. If he flew east, as his miscalculation demanded, he would lead his flight deeper into the Atlantic Ocean, away from land, away from safety, into the gathering darkness of a December evening. For the next several hours, fragmentary communications were received from Flight 19. The radio operators on the ground strained to hear through static and interference, catching only pieces of conversations, glimpses of a tragedy unfolding hundreds of miles away. Taylor's transmissions became increasingly confused and contradictory. At one point, he seemed convinced he was over the Gulf of Mexico. At another, he ordered his flight to turn around and head east. The student pilots, younger and less experienced, apparently questioned his judgment, but military discipline held. They followed their leader, even as the fuel gauges dropped and the sun began to set. Lieutenant Cox continued trying to help, at one point suggesting that if Taylor could not find his way, he should turn his flight control over to one of the planes with a working compass. But Taylor was the senior officer, the veteran pilot, the man in charge. He was not about to relinquish command to a student, not even as the situation deteriorated around him. At approximately 4:45, the senior flight instructor at Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station, Lieutenant Commander Arthur Curtis, took over communications and tried to guide Taylor toward land. He instructed Taylor to fly west, toward the setting sun. It was simple advice, the kind that should have worked. But Taylor was convinced that flying west would take him deeper into the Gulf of Mexico, further from safety. He refused. The weather, which had been favorable when they departed, began to deteriorate as afternoon turned to evening. Rain squalls moved into the area. Visibility dropped. The sun sank toward the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of orange and gold, and then disappeared entirely. Darkness crept across the water, swallowing the small formation of aircraft that was now hopelessly lost somewhere over the vast Atlantic. Through it all, the men on the ground worked frantically to establish a position fix on the lost aircraft. They triangulated radio signals, consulted weather reports, and tried desperately to guide Taylor and his men back to safety. But the radio transmissions were growing weaker, more distorted, harder to understand. At approximately 5:50, one of the land-based radio stations managed to triangulate the flight's position. They determined that Flight 19 was somewhere northeast of their intended route, roughly 200 miles east of Jacksonville, Florida. This placed them far out over the Atlantic, nowhere near the Gulf of Mexico that Taylor believed he was flying over. The information was transmitted to the aircraft, but it is unclear whether Taylor ever received it or whether he trusted it if he did. His transmissions continued to suggest a man who had lost confidence in his instruments, in his training, perhaps in himself. At 6:20, a distorted message came through that sounded like Taylor telling his men to prepare for a water landing when the fuel dropped below 10 gallons. He was preparing for the worst, acknowledging that the aircraft could not stay aloft forever. By 7:04, the last confirmed transmission was received from Flight 19. The words were unclear, garbled by static and distance, but they seemed to be heading further out to sea. After that, there was only silence. The voices that had filled the radio frequencies for nearly 4 hours went quiet. The 14 men of Flight 19 were never heard from again. The Navy immediately launched a massive search and rescue operation. Knowing that the Avengers would have run out of fuel by 8 o'clock that evening, they scrambled every available aircraft. Among them were 2 Martin PBM Mariner flying boats, large twin-engine seaplanes designed specifically for search and rescue missions. These aircraft could land on water and carry survival equipment to downed pilots. One of these Mariners, designated Training 49, took off from Naval Air Station Banana River at 7:27 that evening with a crew of 13 men. At 7:30, the crew sent a routine message confirming that their mission was underway. They were never heard from again. At approximately 7:50 that evening, the crew of the SS Gaines Mills, a tanker passing through the area, reported seeing a massive explosion in the sky to the east of their position. The crew described a brilliant fireball that lit up the night, followed by burning debris falling toward the water. A search of the area found an oil slick on the surface of the ocean, but no survivors, no wreckage, no bodies. The Martin Mariner had vanished just as completely as the 5 Avengers it had been sent to find. In a single December evening, 6 aircraft carrying 27 men had disappeared without leaving a single confirmed trace. The Navy conducted one of the largest air and sea search operations in history over the following days. More than 300 aircraft took to the skies. Dozens of ships combed the waters. They searched over 300,000 square miles of ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic, and even the inland swamps of the Everglades. They found nothing, not a single body, not a single piece of identifiable wreckage from the Avengers, not a single clue as to what had happened to those 27 men. The sea had swallowed them completely. The official investigation that followed was unable to determine a probable cause for the loss of Flight 19. The Navy Board of Inquiry concluded that Lieutenant Taylor had become disoriented, likely due to compass failure, or perhaps simply a psychological collapse under pressure, and had led his flight away from land rather than toward it. The aircraft eventually ran out of fuel and were forced to ditch in the open ocean, where the crews perished in the rough seas and cold December waters. The loss of the Martin Mariner was attributed to an in-flight explosion, likely caused by a fuel leak or vapor ignition, as these aircraft carried enormous quantities of aviation gasoline and were known to be somewhat prone to such accidents. Yet even this official explanation was tinged with uncertainty. The final report famously stated that the investigators were not able to even make a good guess as to what happened. Initially, the Navy Board had concluded that the disaster was primarily due to Taylor becoming lost and leading his flight far out to sea. But Taylor's mother protested this finding, arguing that her son was being blamed unfairly for a tragedy that may have had other causes. Under pressure, the Navy amended the final report to read simply that the cause was unknown. It was a rare admission of bafflement from an institution that prided itself on thoroughness and precision. Something had happened to Flight 19 and Training 49, but exactly what remained a mystery. In the decades that followed, Flight 19 became the cornerstone of the Bermuda Triangle legend. Writers and researchers seized upon the case, embellishing it with details that ranged from the speculative to the outright fantastical. Some claimed that Taylor's final words were that everything looked strange, that even the ocean doesn't look as it should. Others suggested that the aircraft had been swallowed by some unknown force, perhaps a magnetic anomaly that affected compasses and navigation equipment, perhaps a gateway to another dimension, perhaps something even more mysterious. Steven Spielberg's 1977 film, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, famously depicted the Flight 19 aircraft being found in the desert, their crews having been abducted by aliens and then returned decades later, seemingly unaged. The truth, if there is a truth to be found, likely lies at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, buried beneath thousands of feet of cold, dark water, where the secrets of those 14 young men will remain forever hidden. The loss of Flight 19 was devastating, but it was not the largest single disappearance in the history of the Bermuda Triangle. That grim distinction belongs to a ship that vanished nearly 3 decades earlier, taking with her more lives than any other vessel lost in those waters. The story begins in the midst of World War I, when the world was locked in bloody conflict and every resource was precious to the war effort. In the spring of 1918, a massive Navy collier named the USS Cyclops was returning from a voyage to South America, her holds filled with manganese ore, desperately needed for the production of steel and munitions. She was one of the largest ships in the Navy's auxiliary fleet, a floating warehouse that could carry enough fuel and supplies to keep an entire battle group at sea. Her commander was a man of questionable reputation, her crew was demoralized, and her hull may have been weakened by years of hard service. She set sail from Barbados on the 4th of March, bound for Baltimore, and she was never seen again. The USS Cyclops was an imposing vessel, stretching 542 feet from bow to stern and displacing over 19,000 tons when fully loaded. She was one of 4 Proteus-class colliers built for the Navy in the years before the war designed to carry coal and other supplies to fuel the fleet's steam-powered warships. Her massive cargo holds could swallow 12,000 tons of coal or other bulk materials. Her cranes and loading equipment could transfer cargo at rates measured in hundreds of tons per hour. She was, in short, a vital cog in the machinery of naval warfare, the kind of ship that never made headlines, but without which the fighting ships could not function. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, the Cyclops was pressed into military service, her civilian crew replaced by naval personnel operating under wartime regulations. She made several voyages to Europe and South America without major incident, carrying supplies to support the war effort. But there were problems beneath the surface, problems that might have warned a more cautious observer of disasters to come. Lieutenant Commander George Worley, the captain of the Cyclops, was a deeply controversial figure. Born in Germany under the name Johann Friedrich Georg Wichmann, he had immigrated to the United States as a young man and worked his way up through the merchant marine before eventually joining the Naval Auxiliary Service. He was described by those who served under him as gruff, eccentric, and given to carrying a cane despite having no obvious need for one. One crew member who later wrote about his experiences aboard the Cyclops described Worley as a very indifferent seaman and a poor, overly cautious navigator. Another called him unfriendly and taciturn, saying that he was generally disliked by both his officers and men. There were whispers about his German birth, speculation that his loyalties might not lie entirely with his adopted country. There were also darker rumors, stories of crew members who had met suspicious ends, of accidents that might not have been accidents. The atmosphere aboard the Cyclops was toxic. Morale among the crew had deteriorated to dangerous levels. Worley had clashed repeatedly with his executive officer, and the tension between them was palpable. The ship itself was showing signs of age and hard use. One of her two engines had developed problems, forcing her to operate on reduced power. There were reports of cracked structural members, of pipes that leaked, of equipment that functioned poorly or not at all. The Navy had assigned an unusually high-ranking passenger to this particular voyage, the American Consul General to Brazil, a man named Alfred Gottschalk. Whether his presence was meant to keep an eye on the controversial captain, or was simply a matter of convenience, has never been determined. In early January 1918, the Cyclops departed Norfolk, Virginia, bound for Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, with a cargo of nearly 10,000 tons of coal. She arrived without major incident on January 28th and spent the next 2 weeks in port, unloading her coal and taking on a new cargo of manganese ore for the return voyage. Manganese was essential for the production of high-strength steel, and the ore in the Cyclops' holds was desperately needed by American munitions factories. On February 16th, the ship departed Rio, making a scheduled stop in Bahia, Brazil, to take on additional cargo. By the time she was fully loaded, the Cyclops carried over 11,000 tons of ore, a weight that may have stressed her already weakened structure beyond safe limits. The Cyclops arrived at Barbados on March 3, 1918. She took on supplies, conducted minor repairs, and prepared for the final leg of her voyage home. On the morning of March 4th, she steamed out of port, heading north toward the Chesapeake Bay. Her holds were full. Her crew numbered over 300 souls, including officers, enlisted men, and passengers. Among them were 64 naval personnel being transferred to new assignments, the consul general and his staff, and a German officer who was being transported as a prisoner of war. It was a typical wartime complement, men going about their duties, looking forward to reaching home. The Cyclops never arrived. She sent no distress signals. She made no further radio contact with any station. She simply vanished from the face of the earth, taking every man aboard with her. When she failed to appear at Baltimore on schedule, the Navy launched an extensive search operation. Ships were sent to patrol the shipping lanes. Aircraft scanned the waters from above. Inquiries were made at every port along the eastern seaboard and throughout the Caribbean. None of it produced any result. Not a single piece of wreckage was ever recovered. Not a single body was ever found. Not a single lifeboat or life preserver ever washed ashore. The Cyclops had disappeared as completely as if she had sailed off the edge of the world. The loss of the USS Cyclops remains the largest non-combat loss of life in the history of the United States Navy. More than 300 men went to their deaths that March, and not one of them left behind any clue as to what had happened. In the chaos of wartime, initial speculation naturally focused on the possibility of enemy action. German submarines were known to operate in the Caribbean, and the manganese ore in the Cyclops' holds was valuable war material that the enemy would have wanted to deny to American factories. Rumors spread that Worley, with his German birth and suspicious behavior, might have betrayed his crew and delivered the ship to the enemy. Perhaps the Cyclops was even now sitting in some German port, her American crew imprisoned and her cargo feeding the Kaiser's war machine. But when the war ended and German naval records were carefully examined by Allied investigators, they revealed no evidence that any U-boat had attacked or even sighted the missing ship. The German government officially denied any involvement, both during and after the conflict. Records from the Imperial Navy showed no submarine operations in the area where the Cyclops would have been sailing. The theory of enemy action, however satisfying it might have been as an explanation, could not be supported by the evidence. Other theories were proposed over the following decades. Perhaps the heavy cargo of manganese ore had shifted in rough seas, causing the vessel to capsize so quickly that no one had time to send a distress call or launch lifeboats. This theory gained support when it was later learned that two of the Cyclops' sister ships, the Proteus and the Nereus, also disappeared without trace while carrying similar cargoes of metallic ore during World War II. Perhaps there was some fundamental flaw in the design of these vessels that made them vulnerable to catastrophic failure under the weight of heavy, shifting cargo. Perhaps the weakened engine and cracked structural members had finally given way, causing the ship to break apart without warning. Perhaps a sudden storm had overwhelmed her. The truth may never be known. President Woodrow Wilson, when asked about the Cyclops, reportedly said that only God and the sea know what happened to the great ship. More than a century later, his words remain as true as the day he spoke them. The wreck of the USS Cyclops has never been found, despite numerous searches using modern technology. The fate of her more than 300 crew members and passengers remains unknown. And the mystery of her disappearance continues to haunt the waters of the Bermuda Triangle, one of the greatest maritime riddles of all time. If the loss of the Cyclops was defined by its sheer scale, then the disappearances of the Star Tiger and Star Ariel were defined by their profound inexplicability. These two British passenger aircraft vanished almost exactly 1 year apart, both while flying through the same stretch of Atlantic sky, both without warning or explanation, both carrying passengers who expected to reach their destinations within hours. Together, they claimed 51 lives and helped cement the legend of the Bermuda Triangle in the public imagination. To this day, neither aircraft has ever been found, and the causes of their loss remain officially unknown. The Star Tiger was an Avro Tudor Mark IV, a passenger aircraft designed and built in Britain during the final years of World War II. The Tudor was intended to be Britain's answer to the American Douglas DC-4 and Lockheed Constellation, a modern pressurized airliner that could compete for the lucrative transatlantic routes. But the Tudor program was plagued by problems from the start. The aircraft was difficult to fly, demanding constant attention from its pilots. Its systems were temperamental. It had a reputation among aviators for being unforgiving of mistakes. Yet by 1948, British South American Airways, an airline created by former Royal Air Force pilots to serve the previously untapped South American trade routes, had embraced the Tudor as the flagship of its fleet. BSAA was an ambitious company with a bold vision, but its safety record was already troubling when the Star Tiger lifted off from London's Heathrow Airport on January 27, 1948. The aircraft was under the command of Captain Brian McMillan, an experienced former RAF pilot with a distinguished wartime record. McMillan had flown bombers over Europe, survived countless missions, and emerged from the war with decorations and a reputation as a steady hand in difficult situations. His crew included First Officer David Colby, also a former RAF pilot, Radio Officer Robert Tuck, and 3 cabin crew members. In the passenger cabin sat 25 travelers, businessmen and tourists heading for Havana, Cuba, where the warm Caribbean sun awaited them. The route would take them from London to Lisbon, Portugal, then to the Azores for refueling, and finally across nearly 2,000 miles of open Atlantic to Bermuda. From there, another short hop would bring them to their final destination. The first 2 legs of the journey proceeded without significant incident, though there were delays. The Tudor developed minor mechanical problems that required attention on the ground. Weather conditions forced schedule adjustments. By the afternoon of January 29th, the Star Tiger was on the ground at Santa Maria in the Azores, preparing for the longest and most dangerous portion of its journey. The overwater crossing from the Azores to Bermuda was at that time the longest non-stop commercial overseas flight in the world. It would push the Tudor to the very limits of its range, leaving almost no margin for error if headwinds proved stronger than forecast, or if navigation proved less than perfect. The weather report was not encouraging. Strong headwinds were predicted along the route, and there were legitimate concerns that the aircraft might not have enough fuel to complete the crossing safely. Captain McMillan studied the forecasts and made his decision. He would proceed, but he would fly at a lower altitude than usual, where the winds were expected to be somewhat lighter. This would increase fuel consumption due to the denser air, but it would also reduce the effect of the headwinds. It was a calculated risk, the kind of decision that experienced pilots made every day. McMillan was confident that his aircraft could handle the challenge. The Star Tiger took off from Santa Maria at 3:34 in the afternoon local time, climbing into a sky that was already beginning to darken with the approach of evening. The aircraft was heavily loaded, reportedly overweight by nearly 1,000 pounds. Shortly after departure, McMillan radioed back that they were encountering heavy rain and strong winds, but that all was well aboard. For the next 12 hours, the Star Tiger maintained regular radio contact with both the Azores and Bermuda. The crew reported their position at scheduled intervals. They exchanged weather information with another British aircraft, an Avro Lancastrian that had departed ahead of them on the same route. The Lancastrian's crew described difficult conditions, but nothing beyond the capability of a competent pilot to handle. By the early morning hours of January 30th, the Star Tiger was finally approaching Bermuda. The long night crossing was nearly over. At 1:26 in the morning, the aircraft was approximately 350 miles from its destination. The Lancastrian had already landed safely at Kindley Field. Victory was in sight. At 3 o'clock, the Star Tiger reported that it had taken an accurate celestial fix using the stars and discovered that the winds had shifted slightly, pushing them a bit off course. The estimated time of arrival was amended to 5 o'clock in the morning, about an hour later than originally planned. There was no indication of any concern, no hint of alarm in the radio operator's voice. At 3:04, the Star Tiger requested a radio bearing from Bermuda, a standard navigational aid that would help confirm their position. The radio operator in Bermuda replied, instructing the aircraft to change to a different frequency for the bearing procedure. At 3:15, the Bermuda operator attempted to contact the Star Tiger with the requested bearing information. There was no response. He tried again. Silence. Again. Nothing. Repeated attempts were made to raise the Star Tiger throughout the early morning hours, but the aircraft never answered another call. An emergency was declared, and at first light, search and rescue operations began in earnest. Over the next 5 days, 26 aircraft flew more than 800 hours, systematically searching thousands of square miles of ocean. Surface vessels joined the hunt, their crews scanning the waves for any sign of wreckage or survivors. They found nothing. Not a piece of debris, not a life jacket, not a drop of fuel oil floating on the surface. The Star Tiger had simply ceased to exist somewhere in the darkness over the Atlantic. The British government convened a formal court of investigation, only the second such inquiry in British aviation history, the first having been conducted after the loss of the airship R-101 in 1930. Expert witnesses testified about every aspect of the aircraft's design, maintenance history, and operational procedures. The investigation examined dozens of possible causes, from mechanical failure to fuel exhaustion to navigational error to catastrophic structural breakup. Investigators considered whether the crew might have become incapacitated by carbon monoxide poisoning from a defective heater. They analyzed weather patterns, radio propagation conditions, and ocean currents. In the end, the court was unable to determine what had happened. The final report, presented to Parliament in September 1948, contained words that have echoed through the decades since. In closing this gruesome account of a gruesome task, the investigators wrote, "It may truly be said that no more baffling problem has ever been presented for investigation. What happened in this case will never be known. The fate of Star Tiger must forever remain an unsolved mystery." Almost exactly 1 year later, the mystery deepened immeasurably when another BSAA Tudor vanished under circumstances that were, if anything, even more inexplicable. On January 17, 1949, the Avro Tudor Star Ariel was on the ground at Kindley Field in Bermuda, awaiting instructions. The aircraft had recently arrived from London and was scheduled to continue on to Kingston, Jamaica, carrying passengers who were eager to complete their journey. But fate intervened in the form of mechanical trouble aboard another Tudor, the Star Lion, which suffered an engine failure on approach to Bermuda. Star Lion landed safely, but she clearly would not be flying anywhere until repairs could be made. Star Ariel was hastily pressed into service to take on Star Lion's stranded passengers and continue the journey. Captain John Clutham McPhee was in command. A former Royal New Zealand Air Force pilot with extensive experience, McPhee was by all accounts a capable and careful aviator. He had flown the Bermuda-Jamaica route many times before and knew its challenges well. His crew was experienced. His aircraft had been properly maintained. The weather that morning was exceptional. Clear skies, good visibility, light winds. It was as close to perfect flying conditions as any pilot could hope for. Star Ariel lifted off from Bermuda at 8:41 in the morning with 7 crew members and 13 passengers aboard. Captain McPhee decided to take advantage of the beautiful weather by flying at a higher altitude than usual, 18,000 feet, where the thin air would allow for faster, more fuel-efficient cruising. About an hour into the flight, at approximately 9:42, McPhee sent a routine radio message to Bermuda. His words were calm, almost casual. He reported his departure time, his current altitude, and his estimated time of arrival in Kingston. He announced that he was changing radio frequency to contact Kingston directly for the remainder of the flight. Everything was proceeding normally. There was no hint of trouble. That was the last anyone ever heard from the Star Ariel. When the aircraft failed to contact Kingston at its scheduled time, concern rippled through the airline's operations center. Attempts were made to reach the aircraft on multiple frequencies. There was no response. By late afternoon, when the Star Ariel's fuel would have been long exhausted, it was clear that disaster had struck. A massive search operation was launched, covering thousands of square miles of Caribbean water. American and British aircraft flew sortie after sortie, their crews straining their eyes against the glare of the sun on the sea, searching for any trace of wreckage. Ships crisscrossed the area, their lookouts scanning the waves. Once again, nothing was found. Star Ariel had vanished as completely as her sister ship had 1 year before. The investigation that followed found no evidence of mechanical failure, no indication of adverse weather, no suggestion that the crew had encountered any difficulty whatsoever. The aircraft had been flying in clear skies, at cruise altitude, with ample fuel for the journey, when it simply ceased to exist. The Chief Inspector of Accidents, in his final report released in December 1949, could only conclude that through lack of evidence due to no wreckage having been found, the cause of the accident is unknown. It was an echo of the Star Tiger report, another admission that the experts were baffled. The loss of Star Tiger and Star Ariel had profound consequences. All BSAA Tudor aircraft were immediately grounded and never returned to passenger service. Within a year, British South American Airways had ceased to exist as an independent company, absorbed by its parent corporation after a string of accidents that destroyed public confidence. The Tudor design itself was permanently retired from commercial aviation, and the back-to-back disappearances of these 2 aircraft became forever linked to the emerging legend of the Bermuda Triangle, twin mysteries that seemed to defy all rational explanation. On the morning of February 2, 1963, the SS Marine Sulphur Queen departed Beaumont, Texas, bound for Norfolk, Virginia, with one of the most unusual and dangerous cargoes ever carried by sea. She was a converted tanker ship, originally built during World War II to carry petroleum, but extensively modified in 1960 to transport molten sulfur heated to over 250 degrees Fahrenheit. The conversion had been extensive, requiring the removal of internal bulkheads and the construction of massive heated tanks to keep the sulfur in liquid form throughout the voyage. The ship was 524 feet long, displaced more than 7,000 tons, and carried a crew of 39 men who knew they were sailing on something unusual. None of them would ever be seen again. The Marine Sulphur Queen was not a healthy ship. Former crew members who had sailed on her in the months before her final voyage painted a disturbing picture of a vessel in severe disrepair. The steam coils that kept the sulfur heated were prone to failure. Temperature gauges were inoperative or gave unreliable readings. Corrosion had eaten into the ship's structural members. Fire was a constant risk. And on at least one occasion, the ship had arrived in port with flames still burning around her cargo tanks. The hull itself was showing signs of weakness, with cracks appearing in places that should have been solid steel. Two tankers like the Marine Sulphur Queen had a troubling history. Several had broken apart in heavy seas during the preceding decade. The ship had been scheduled for dry dock inspection in January 1963, where these concerns could have been properly evaluated and addressed. But the owners had postponed the inspection because cargo deliveries were running behind schedule. Commercial pressure trumped safety. One new crewman, reporting to the ship just before she sailed on what would be her final voyage, turned to his wife and told her that the vessel was a floating garbage can. It was a grim assessment that would prove tragically accurate. The Marine Sulphur Queen's last voyage began on February 2nd with a cargo of over 15,000 tons of molten sulfur. For 2 days, she proceeded along her route without incident. On February 4th, at approximately 1:25 in the morning, while the ship was approximately 200 miles off Key West, a seaman aboard the vessel placed a routine ship-to-shore radio call to his stockbroker in Florida. The call was mundane, unremarkable, the kind of personal communication that sailors made all the time. The seaman placed his order and hung up. It was the last communication anyone would ever receive from the Marine Sulphur Queen. When the ship failed to arrive in Norfolk on February 7th, the Coast Guard initiated a search. Aircraft took to the skies. Ships were dispatched to patrol the shipping lanes. The search expanded rapidly, eventually covering thousands of square miles of the Gulf of Mexico and the Straits of Florida. After nearly 2 weeks of intensive effort, only a handful of objects were recovered: a life ring bearing the ship's name, several life jackets, a shirt tied to a floating ring, a foghorn, and scattered debris that might or might not have come from the missing vessel. The Coast Guard noted grimly that one of the recovered life jackets bore teeth marks consistent with attacks by sharks or other predatory fish. No bodies were ever found. No significant wreckage was ever located. The Marine Sulphur Queen had vanished. The investigation that followed was damning. The Coast Guard determined that the Marine Sulphur Queen had been unseaworthy at the time of her departure and never should have been allowed to sail. The converted tanker had suffered from fundamental design flaws that made her vulnerable to catastrophic failure. The removal of internal bulkheads during the conversion had weakened her structure. The constant heating of the sulfur cargo created thermal stresses that the original design had never anticipated. The corrosion that former crew members had reported had likely compromised her hull integrity. The Coast Guard concluded that the ship had probably suffered structural failure, perhaps breaking in two, and had sunk so rapidly that the crew had no time to send a distress signal, launch lifeboats, or take any meaningful action to save themselves. Yet despite this seemingly logical explanation, the Marine Sulphur Queen became one of the most frequently cited examples of Bermuda Triangle mystery. Vincent Gaddis mentioned her by name in his 1964 article that first coined the term Bermuda Triangle, reducing her fate to sailing into the unknown. The mundane reality of a poorly maintained ship succumbing to its own defects was transformed into something far more mysterious. Another victim claimed by the Devil's Triangle. The morning of January 31st, 1921, broke cold and gray over the treacherous waters off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. This stretch of coast had earned a fearsome reputation among sailors over the centuries, a place where warm Gulf Stream waters collided with cold currents from the north, where shifting sandbars lurked just beneath the surface, where sudden storms could catch even experienced mariners off guard. They called it the graveyard of the Atlantic, and the nickname was well-deserved. Hundreds of ships had met their end here over the years, their bones scattered across the sandy bottom. That morning, a Coast Guard surfman named C.P. Brady was scanning the horizon with his station's powerful telescope when he spotted something unusual through the mist. A magnificent 5-masted schooner was drifting toward the shore, her sails still set, moving erratically with the wind and waves. She had run aground on Diamond Shoals, a particularly dangerous stretch of sandbars that extended far out from the Cape. Even from a distance, something about the vessel seemed wrong. There was no movement on her deck, no crew visible at her helm, no response to signals. The ship hung there like a phantom, and in the days and weeks that followed, her story would become one of the strangest maritime mysteries ever recorded. The vessel was the Carroll A. Deering, a 255-foot commercial schooner built in 1919 by the G.G. Deering Company of Bath, Maine, a town famous for its shipyards and the quality of its craftsmanship. She was among the last wooden sailing vessels of her type, constructed just before the industry's permanent transition to iron and steel hulls. The Deering had been making regular cargo runs between American ports and South America, carrying coal southward and returning with various goods. She was a beautiful ship, graceful in the water, a reminder of an era that was rapidly passing into history. The Deering's final voyage had begun in late August of 1920, when she departed Norfolk, Virginia, under the command of Captain William Merritt, bound for Rio de Janeiro with a full cargo of coal. But Merritt had fallen seriously ill during the voyage, and when the ship reached Lewis, Delaware, he was too sick to continue. A replacement captain was hastily recruited, a 66-year-old mariner named William Wormel, who had decades of sailing experience but had never commanded this particular vessel or worked with this particular crew. Captain Wormel was a respected figure in maritime circles, but the voyage to South America under his command was troubled from the start. His newly appointed first mate, a man named Charles McClellan, proved to be difficult, resentful, and possibly dangerous. In Barbados, where the Deering stopped to take on supplies for the return voyage, McClellan went on a drinking binge that ended with his arrest. While intoxicated, he was overheard making threatening remarks about Captain Wormel, telling anyone who would listen that he would get the captain before we get to Norfolk. It was the kind of statement that should have raised alarms, but Captain Wormel, perhaps too trusting, or perhaps simply unable to find a suitable replacement at such short notice, bailed McClellan out of jail and allowed him to remain as first mate. On January 9, 1921, the Carroll A. Deering set sail from Barbados, homeward bound for Maine. 20 days later, on January 29th, the ship was spotted passing the Cape Lookout lightship off the North Carolina coast. A crewman aboard the Deering used a megaphone to shout across the water to the lightship keeper, a man named Captain Jacobson. The message was that they had lost their anchors and needed to report this to their company. Jacobson noted in his log that the man who spoke did not appear to be an officer, which was highly unusual. Maritime protocol demanded that communications with other vessels be handled by the captain or a senior officer, not by ordinary seamen. Jacobson also noted that the crew seemed to be milling about on deck in a disorganized, chaotic manner, as if discipline had broken down. The Deering continued north, and that was the last time anyone saw her crew alive. 2 days later, when the seas calmed enough for a rescue crew to reach the grounded vessel, what they found was deeply unsettling. The Carol A. Deering was completely abandoned. The crew's personal belongings were still aboard, their sea bags stowed in their quarters. The lifeboats were missing. The navigation equipment, including the ship's compass and charts, had been removed. In the galley, food was being prepared on the stove, as though someone had been in the middle of making a meal when disaster struck. The captain's cabin was in wild disarray, papers and charts scattered everywhere, furniture overturned, as if there had been a struggle or a frantic search for something. A single 6-toed cat was found wandering the deck, the only living thing aboard. But of Captain Wormel and his 10 crew members, there was no sign. The mystery of the Carol A. Deering sparked one of the most intensive maritime investigations in American history. The Coast Guard, the FBI, the State Department, and the Department of Commerce all became involved. Theories multiplied as investigators tried to make sense of what they had found. Perhaps the crew had mutinied, killed the captain, and then abandoned ship for reasons unknown. Perhaps they had been attacked by pirates or rum runners operating during Prohibition, boarded and abducted by criminals who saw an opportunity. Perhaps they had fallen victim to Bolshevik agents, a theory that gained traction when a message in a bottle was found on a North Carolina beach claiming that the Deering had been captured by an oil-burning boat. The message in the bottle seemed like a breakthrough, the first real evidence of what might have happened. Handwriting analysis suggested it had been written by the ship's engineer, but the hope was short-lived. Investigation revealed that the message was a hoax, fabricated by the man who claimed to have found it in an attempt to discredit the local lighthouse keepers and take their jobs. It was a cruel deception that wasted valuable investigative resources and sent the inquiry down a blind alley. The investigation continued for more than a year before quietly winding down without any official conclusion. The Carol A. Deering was eventually dynamited by the Coast Guard to prevent her from becoming a hazard to navigation. The fate of her crew was never determined, and the ghost ship of Diamond Shoals passed into legend, another victim perhaps of the mysterious waters where the Bermuda Triangle touches the graveyard of the Atlantic. The evening of December 22nd, 1967, should have been magical. Christmas lights twinkled along the Miami shoreline, their reflections dancing on the calm waters of Biscayne Bay like countless colored stars. The weather was mild, the seas were calm, and the holiday spirit was in the air. Dan Barak, a 42-year-old hotel magnate and experienced yachtsman, invited his friend Father Patrick Horgan, a 55-year-old Catholic priest from Fort Lauderdale, to join him aboard his boat for a short evening cruise to view the decorations from the water. It was the kind of simple pleasure that Miami residents enjoyed during the holiday season, a tradition as old as the city's Christmas lights themselves. Burak's vessel was a 23-foot cabin cruiser named Witchcraft. She was his pride and joy, a luxury yacht equipped with every modern convenience and safety feature available at the time. Her manufacturer had built flotation devices directly into her hull, a design feature that they claimed made her virtually unsinkable. Even if her hull were punctured, the theory went, she would remain buoyant enough to keep her occupants above water until help arrived. Burak had spent thousands of dollars on his boat and knew her intimately. He had made this same short cruise many times before. The plan was straightforward. Motor out about a mile from shore to the vicinity of buoy number 7 at the entrance to Miami Harbor, cut the engine, and enjoy the spectacular view of the city lights. They would be home in time for a late evening drink. It should have been completely routine. At approximately 9 o'clock that evening, the Miami Coast Guard received a radio call from Dan Barak aboard the Witchcraft. His voice was calm and steady, betraying no hint of panic or urgency. He reported that the boat had struck something in the water near buoy number 7. The impact had disabled his propulsion system, probably damaging the propeller or rudder. He was not in any danger, he emphasized. The boat was not taking on water. He simply needed a tow back to the marina. Barak told the Coast Guard that he would fire a signal flare to indicate his exact position so they could find him easily. It was a textbook distress call, the kind of minor incident that the Coast Guard handled routinely. Exactly 19 minutes later, a Coast Guard vessel arrived at buoy number 7. The crew scanned the water with searchlights, sweeping the surface in ever-widening circles, looking for the Witchcraft and the signal flare that Barak had promised to fire. They found nothing. No boat, no flare, no debris, no sign that Dan Barak, Father Horgan, or the Witchcraft had ever been there at all. The Coast Guard immediately expanded their search. Within hours, additional vessels and aircraft had joined the effort. Searchlights played across the dark water. Helicopters hovered overhead, their powerful searchlights turning night into day. The search area was expanded again and again, eventually encompassing over 24,000 square miles of ocean. For 6 consecutive days, dozens of ships and aircraft combed the waters off Miami, looking for any trace of the missing boat. Private vessels up to 50 miles away were notified and asked to keep watch. Divers explored the sea bottom near buoy number 7. Absolutely nothing was found. Not a piece of fiberglass, not a life jacket, not a single item that could be connected to the Witchcraft or her occupants. The disappearance defied every attempt at explanation. Dan Barak had made his calm, unhurried distress call from less than a mile offshore, in calm seas, on a waterway crowded with other boats that were out enjoying the Christmas lights. Help had arrived in less than 20 minutes. The Witchcraft was equipped with flotation devices that should have kept her on the surface even with catastrophic hull damage. Even if she had somehow sunk instantaneously, her built-in flotation should have prevented her from going to the bottom. Even if both men had somehow fallen overboard, life jackets and other floating debris should have been scattered on the surface. There had been no storm, no rough weather, no obvious hazard that could account for such a sudden and complete disappearance. The Coast Guard officially concluded their investigation with the cryptic statement that Barak and Horgan were presumed missing, but not lost at sea. It was a careful distinction, an acknowledgement that they simply had no idea what had happened. Some investigators privately speculated that the 2 men might have faked their disappearance for reasons unknown, but no evidence ever emerged to support this theory. The Witchcraft has never been found. Dan Barak and Father Patrick Horgan have never been seen again. The Christmas evening cruise that was supposed to end with holiday cheer ended instead with one of the most puzzling vanishings in Bermuda Triangle history. On the night of December 28, 1948, as the holiday season was winding down and thoughts were turning toward the new year, a Douglas DC-3 airliner was preparing for departure at the San Juan Airport in Puerto Rico. The aircraft, registered as NC 16002, was operated by Airborne Transport, a small charter company. It was scheduled for a routine overnight flight to Miami, Florida, a journey of approximately 1,000 miles that should have taken about 5 hours. In the passenger cabin were 29 travelers, including tourists heading home after Caribbean vacations, businessmen returning to work, and others with their own reasons for flying north that December night. In the cockpit sat Captain Robert Lindquist and co-pilot Ernest Hill. experienced aviators who had flown this route many times before. Stewardess Mary Burke attended to the passengers as they settled into their seats. The DC-3 was one of the most successful and reliable aircraft ever designed, a twin-engine workhorse that had served military and civilian operators around the world since the mid-1930s. NC 16002 herself was a veteran, having accumulated more than 28,000 flight hours since her construction in 1936. She had been thoroughly inspected in recent months and certified as airworthy. Her engines had been replaced just the previous November. There was nothing remarkable about the aircraft, the crew, or the flight plan. Everything pointed toward a routine overnight crossing. But problems emerged even before takeoff. When the DC-3 had landed in San Juan earlier that day, Captain Lindquist reported to the ground crew that the landing gear warning light was not functioning properly, and that the aircraft's batteries were discharged and low on water. This was concerning. The batteries powered essential systems, including the radio, and depleted batteries could cause serious problems during flight. The ground crew told Lindquist that fully recharging the batteries would take several hours, which would delay departure significantly. Faced with this choice, Lindquist made a fateful decision. Rather than wait on the ground, he would take off and recharge the batteries in flight using the aircraft's engine-driven generators. It was a calculated gamble that would have profound consequences. The DC-3 finally lifted off at 10:03 in the evening, nearly 2 hours behind schedule. Because of the weak batteries, the radio could receive transmissions but could not transmit, leaving the aircraft temporarily unable to communicate with air traffic control. Lindquist circled over San Juan for 11 minutes while the generators slowly brought the batteries up to sufficient charge. By 10:14, two-way radio communication was finally established, and the aircraft set course for Miami. The weather along the route was reported to be good, with clear skies and light winds. It seemed as though the battery problem had been overcome. At 11:23, approximately an hour after takeoff, NC 16002 contacted the Air Route Traffic Control Center in Miami. Captain Lindquist reported that they were cruising at 8,300 feet, that conditions were good, and that their estimated time of arrival was 4:03 in the morning. Everything was proceeding normally. The flight continued through the night, the twin engines droning steadily as the DC-3 ate up the miles between Puerto Rico and Florida. The last transmission came at approximately 4:13 in the morning, when the aircraft was estimated to be within 50 miles of Miami. Captain Lindquist's voice came through clearly on the radio. "We are approaching the field," he reported. "We can see the lights of Miami now. All is well. We will stand by for landing instructions." It was a completely routine message, the words of a pilot who expected to be on the ground within minutes, ready to stretch his legs and get some breakfast before the sun came up. NC 16002 never arrived. The aircraft never contacted Miami Approach Control. It never made another radio call. It simply vanished from the sky within sight of its destination, without warning or explanation. The lights of Miami that Captain Lindquist had reported seeing continued to twinkle along the shoreline, but the DC-3 and its 32 occupants were gone. The search operation that followed was massive, covering more than 80,000 square miles of ocean. Dozens of aircraft and ships crisscrossed the area where the DC-3 should have been. The shallow, crystal-clear waters around the Florida Keys were searched with particular care, as any wreckage there should have been easily visible from the air. Investigators theorized that a wind shift that had been transmitted to other aircraft in the area, but possibly not received by NC 16002, due to its earlier radio difficulties, might have pushed the DC-3 off course. Search areas were expanded to include Cuba, the Gulf of Mexico, and even the Florida Everglades. Nothing was found. Not a single piece of debris, not a single body, not a trace of fuel oil on the surface of the water. The official investigation could determine no probable cause for the loss. The aircraft had been airworthy. The crew had been experienced. The weather had been good. The Civil Aeronautics Board noted the battery problems and the radio difficulties, but could not establish any direct link between these issues and the disappearance. The final report simply stated that the aircraft was lost for unknown reasons, joining the growing list of mysteries that would eventually become associated with the Bermuda Triangle. On the morning of November 29, 1925, the SS Cotopaxi steamed out of Charleston, South Carolina, her holds full of coal and her crew of 32 prepared for what should have been a routine voyage to Havana, Cuba. She was a steam-powered bulk carrier, not glamorous but solidly built, the kind of working man's ship that kept the economy moving. Captain W.J. Meyer had made this crossing many times before. The weather was not ideal, but nothing beyond what an experienced captain and crew could handle. There was no reason to expect anything other than a successful voyage. 2 days later, on December 1st, the Cotopaxi sent out a distress signal. The message, picked up by a radio station in Jacksonville, Florida, indicated that the ship was taking on water and struggling against rough seas. Her position placed her in the vicinity of the Florida Straits, perhaps 50 miles off the coast. Then silence. The Cotopaxi vanished without another word, taking all 32 men aboard to their deaths. For nearly a century, the fate of the Cotopaxi remained unknown. She became one of the classic Bermuda Triangle mysteries, her story embellished and mythologized over the decades. Director Steven Spielberg immortalized her name in his 1977 film, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where the Cotopaxi is shown mysteriously appearing in the Gobi Desert, returned by aliens who had taken her crew decades before. The actual ship, meanwhile, lay undiscovered somewhere beneath the waves, keeping her secrets. In 2020, marine biologist Michael Barnett finally solved the mystery. Through painstaking archival research, Barnett discovered that a shipwreck known to local divers as the Bear Wreck, lying on the ocean floor about 35 miles off St. Augustine, Florida, was actually the long-lost Cotopaxi. Working with British historian Guy Walters, Barnett matched the wreck's dimensions and location to the ship's last known position and confirmed the identification through insurance documents and court records from the lawsuits filed by the families of the lost crew. The truth proved to be far more mundane than any Bermuda Triangle legend. The Cotopaxi had sailed into a powerful storm with cargo hatches that were in poor repair. Water flooded into her holds, and she went down quickly, too fast for her crew to save themselves. There was no supernatural force at work, no mysterious disappearance, just a ship caught in bad weather with inadequate equipment, the kind of maritime tragedy that has claimed countless vessels throughout history. Interestingly, the wreck of the Cotopaxi lies outside the commonly accepted boundaries of the Bermuda Triangle. Her inclusion in the legend says more about our love of mystery than about any actual anomaly in those waters. As Barnett noted, many of the stories attributed to the triangle actually occurred well beyond its supposed borders. The myth has a way of expanding to absorb any convenient mystery. The waters of the Bermuda Triangle have claimed many victims over the years, some lost to storms, some to mechanical failure, some to human error, and a handful to causes that remain genuinely unknown even after careful investigation. The legend has grown in the telling, embellished by writers seeking to sell books and filmmakers seeking to thrill audiences. Many of the stories attributed to the triangle have been debunked by patient researchers who examine the evidence rather than accepting the myth. Yet even when the known facts are stripped away and the exaggerations are set aside, a few cases remain that continue to resist easy explanation. Disappearances so sudden and complete that they haunt our imagination still. Perhaps that is the true power of the Bermuda Triangle, not as a place of actual supernatural danger, but as a symbol of how vast and unknowable the ocean remains, even in an age of satellites and sonar and global positioning systems. The sea keeps its secrets well. Ships still sink without warning. Aircraft still crash without explanation. And sometimes, despite all our technology, people simply vanish into the mist, leaving behind nothing but questions that may never be answered. Thank you so much for listening tonight. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue exploring the mysteries that lurk in the shadows of history. Until next time, sleep well.